Okay, so hopefully I have all of your prints. Remember, these prints are just for reference. The ones that I will actually grade are the ones you post online. You should have, and I'll be lenient because this is the first assignment you guys have done. You should, by now, have posted them to the course website. It should be the original, and it should be the one that you edited. And you should also have a paragraph that says what changes you made in Photoshop to your image. Okay? If you haven't done that, go back to your post and edit it and make sure that that's the way it is. Okay? Yeah.
I just make the photos in the system gallery, then get that.
As long as I see the two images, I don't care. Okay, and so we've got that done. You got two handouts today. One is exercise 107 that we're going to do in a little bit, and I'll walk you through. The other is assignment 102. It does say that on Wednesday, 9/17, we're going to show some of the images. Obviously, that date is wrong, so we will change that, and you will see them, I promise. Assignment 102, you don't really have the Photoshop skills to do it yet, but it's worth starting to think about. It's also worth starting to look at the other examples that people have done in 102 so that you can start to get prepared for the kinds of images that you're going to create. I put an example on the bottom. This is from 3 or 4 years ago. I thought it was a particularly clever one. The point is you're going to combine two images or make something happen that shouldn't normally happen. And so it tends to be a really fun one. People have a good time doing it. So we'll do something along those lines. And I will show you some examples. Today, we're going to talk about high dynamic range photography, which is it's a bit of an advanced topic to some degree. It's a bit hard to understand initially. It's also strange because I teach it in this class, and it's important to understand what it is. But for you guys, it will be all about making a pretty image. For the Rhino class and for rendering, the high dynamic range images are what provide really good quality backdrop renderings for V-Ray. And so there is a use for both HDR photography and the panoramic photography that we'll talk about on Monday, and combining the two when you get down the road doing high-end renderings. So having the skills, understanding what they are, understanding how to work with them is really, really important for down the road. But you guys aren't to the advanced 3D modeling, Rhino renderings, V-Ray, all that stuff yet. So it's a little bit cart before the horse. But at the same time, we're talking about photography, we're talking about Photoshop. It's the appropriate time to talk about high dynamic range photography. My guess is that you've probably seen high dynamic range images before. If you do a Google search for HDR image or high dynamic range image, there are tons and tons and tons of them because there are a lot of artists who really enjoy playing around with high dynamic range photography. Basically what it is it's a way of mimicking the way we see an environment. Our eyes and brains are much, much faster than any camera at changing and adapting for varying light settings. So if we're sitting in this room, and today happens to be a very dull, dark day outside, so I can't use the best examples of a bright, sunny day, but if we're sitting in this room and I'm looking over at you guys are relatively dark in shadow, but my eyes still see all the details of what's going on there. And if I really quickly switch and look outside, my eyes instantly adjust for what the exposure would be outside. Right? And so I can be inside a room and I can look and see all the dark stuff, and then I can glance outside and I can see everything in detail outside. That is effectively high dynamic range. My eyes are seeing, my brain is processing that kind of imagery. If we were taking a camera and trying to do the same thing, there would be a lag for the camera to adjust. And you've probably seen this. Let's say you're recording a video with your iPhone or something and it's really dark and then you go to really light. It takes a little bit of time for the camera to wait, I have to readjust, and then finally I can see the video that's outside. Right? Furthermore, if I was taking an image from this corner, and I think we talked about this when I was talking about bracketing imaging, if I was taking an image from this corner, I could expose for you guys and have nothing, no detail outside. I could expose for outside and you guys would all be dark. Right? Because I'm limited in that sense. If we do high dynamic range photography, though, I can get you guys exposed properly and outside exposed properly. So we're trying to blend those together. And we can get images like this. Okay? So it's a way of certainly making beautiful photos, but it's also something that we can use down the road in renderings and that sort of thing. So why do we care about high dynamic range photography? It's basically to more accurately represent what our eyes see in reality. And this is the best example of this is you go take a picture of a sunset, and it's never as good as the actual sunset, right? And therein lies the promise. Now, my guess is this is fairly close to what the people were seeing when they were at the sunset, right? So this is a lot closer than what we would normally take as a photo. So high dynamic range lets us approximate that, okay? So we're mimicking how the human eye sees it. Tone mapping is the technique through which we basically make the image viewable on a low dynamic range device. And so by a low dynamic range device, I mean a piece of paper. That would be low dynamic range device. I mean our computer monitors, anything, our iPads, our iPhones, right? Those are low dynamic range devices. This is how we're able to see it, right? So it's a post-processing technique. It reduces the overall contrast to facilitate a display of HDR images on these low dynamic range devices. And it can be applied to produce images with either a fairly realistic interpretation of what the lighting in the scene is, or a very exaggerated, kind of almost strange, so you can push the envelope of what you can do with this. So it can be on the artistic side. Okay? What it does is, at the small level, it reduces the dynamic range or contrast ratio of the entire image, but it retains localized contrast between certain pieces. Right? So if we're looking at the dark region, right, it exposes and gives us localized contrast so we can still see detail, right? That's how we're seeing the detail. But at the same time, instead of stripping out the information somewhere else in the image, right, it retains the localized contrast there too, right? So it changes the look of the image as a whole. So we have a couple software choices for how we go through and process this. Some are expensive, some are not. Photoshop is obviously what we're discussing in this class. It would be really bad of me not to teach you how to do this in Photoshop, because that's obviously what we're doing. Merge to HDR is an automated action, so it's actually pretty easy to create these. The post-processing is necessary to get whatever your desired results are, right? You have to do something more. It's not going to automatically do it for you. And we're going to talk about that. There isn't a built-in tone mapping feature. You kind of have to do your own tone mapping. It's not as easy as a couple little sliders and it does it. But the good news is it's available on the lab computers, and it's free for you to use on the lab computers. Now, if you want to buy your own, obviously it's expensive. Photomatics is another piece of software that's really considered to be the gold standard in doing HDR processing and tone mapping. It's kind of the best that's out there. There are plugins that work with Photoshop, so if you're working in Photoshop, you can get the Photomatics plugin that does this. And it basically does the tone mapping. It's really easy. You adjust a few sliders, and it magically creates these images. It's really nice. It's a little on the expensive side for the standalone version, but there is a big student discount if you're interested. So let's look at some examples, right, so we can talk about it. This is kind of the most architectural example in trying to see what's happening. And this is something, let's say you're in real estate and you're trying to take photos of a loft because you're trying to sell it or rent it or whatever. All too common, you end up with this photo here where you have the nice exposure for the inside. Oh, it's a pretty nice space. We can't see anything about the view, when the view might be the selling point of why you want to show this. If we expose the opposite, right, the interior would be too dark. You can't see the interior. So this is the high dynamic range version of it. It's not exaggerated, it's not moody, it's not artistic, it's just there. And what it's allowing us to do is see the whole skyline of the city out of the windows and the properly exposed interior of the shot. So there's definitely an advantage to doing something like this when you have an indoor and an outdoor scene. Sometimes it's about giving a little bit more texture to the sky or enhancing the colors, giving a little bit more saturation. This is in San Francisco. Probably a little bit exaggerated for artistic purposes, but it's not unreasonably so. I'll show you some that have been pushed out a little bit further. Another example here, this kind of twilight is a good time to take the HDR images because you're dealing with some really dark shadows, and you can bring up the lighting conditions of those shadows, give yourself a little bit more detail, a little bit more glow. Right? Sometimes it's as simple as an outdoor photograph. Right? This is not the kind that you would typically say, oh, I need an HDR image. You'd say, oh, no, I can take it. But what it's done is it's given us a lot more detail in the shadows here than we would otherwise have. So it's subtle, but at the same time, it is giving us a little bit more detail. Right? This is another of those kind of twilight scenes where we have lighting being brought in, artificial lighting, but we still want some of the background natural light, so that it's not really a night photo yet. High dynamic range is great for this. It also eliminates a lot of the shadows, right? Parts of this side of the building might have been too dark in the initial image, but since it's HDR, we're seeing the outside of the building and we're seeing the glow of the lights from the inside. Again, not particularly exaggerated, right? The haunted house look, right? This is starting to get on the exaggerated side. This is for you, right? Pushing the boundaries a little bit. We're getting a little bit artistic, right? If we were standing there, this is probably not exactly what we were seeing, but at the same time, it certainly has a kind of a moodiness to it that is meeting the purpose of that particular photo, right? The other thing that happens is a lot of times these HDR images are taken over a little bit of time, 2-3 seconds, and you can get some movement in them if the clouds are really moving, that sort of thing. So you can get a little bit of a blended texture in the skies and that sort of thing. Again, not overly done, but kind of a little bit painterly in the processing, certainly in the sky. Okay, another one of the Golden Gate Bridge. This is probably on the extreme side, right? We push the envelope of what HDR can do. If I were standing here looking at this view, it probably didn't look like this, right? And so this is going a little bit beyond what the HDR images can be, but when you're playing around with it, there's nothing wrong with trying and pushing it a little bit. So this is what I was talking about in the world of Rhino and kind of high-end renderings and that sort of thing. What we can do is we can capture a high dynamic range, full panoramic image. And so this is an example of one of those. The idea here is that if I were to take this side, right, of the image, and I were to take this side of the image, and I were to bend it around and connect it together, that would give me a full 360 degrees of my scene. Furthermore, if I took the bottom of the image and the top of the image and bent them together, right, that would cover the bottom and cover the top. And so I'd get a full 360 of what this particular scene is, right? And we'll talk about panoramic photography a lot next class. But if you're shooting in high dynamic range and you have this kind of a panorama, you can use it as a backdrop for a rendering and get a lot of lighting conditions. And the advantage of the high dynamic range settings is not necessarily for the overexposed sky and the moodiness of the image. What it is it allows the computer, or it allows V-Ray, to change based on the settings of the rendering what the sky looks like, right? So if it's a midday rendering and you're exposing outside, you could get sky exposure, right, so that you can see what the sky looks like. But then if you go inside the house, it can change what the sky looks like. So it gives us a lot of ability when we do that rendering. Again, a little bit beyond what you need for this class, but certainly something that you're going toward. Something like this, colors are a little bit oversaturated because of the HDR post-processing. I would argue that this is on the border of oversaturated, a little bit too much post-processing. Something like this is fairly subtle. What happened is right in here, if this were just a normal image, not an HDR image, we'd get this completely black, and we wouldn't have any of the detail. Certainly, if you look at it on the computer screen rather than the projector, we always lose a little bit here. You can see all of the detail that's happening in here, the structure underneath the building, that sort of thing, simply by making it an HDR. So it's all about the shadow, but not much more post-processing than that. Another example here of kind of the sunset scene, but I like this example because it shows you that these pictures are taken over time, and it's 2 or 3 exposures, or 3, 5, or 7 exposures that have then been combined together. And so if we look carefully at like this car, for example, right, we have the back half of the car and then it jumped and moved forward in the scene because it was taken in several photographs. Same thing happens with people. Right, this guy doesn't have a head. Right, there's those kinds of issues that happen because we're taking this over a period of time. And so if you think about 3 pictures, it's still going to take at least a second to take those 3 pictures, even if you just rapid fire 1, 2, 3. It's still going to take a little bit of time to do it. And so we have to be aware that these kinds of artifacts and movements and issues can happen in a high dynamic range image. Right, another example here, subtle, not over-processed, but at the same time we get a lot of information about what's happening in the shadow. If this were a normal photo, we wouldn't have that. It would be dark. Right. Same kind of a thing. Image quality here is not very good, but it's the same thing where we've got a lot of dark area in the photo, and we want to have that properly exposed, but then the light area we don't want to be oversaturated or overblown out.
Like it was rendered.
Some of that was rendered, I believe. Another example here, this one's way over processed to me, but again, it's about showing that sky. Right? Very moody type photo, but at the same time, kind of an attractive photo. We're seeing a lot of the detail that would otherwise be in the shadow because of that HDR image. More of the same. Right? Again, photos taken over time, you're going to get a lot of blurring of any movement that's in a scene. So you want to be aware and take advantage of that. Right, same kind of thing here. Good example here of detail that would otherwise be lost in the shadow, but not over-processed. Right, this is one of the example photomatics. That's why there's the little watermarks on it. So just some more. Sunset's a particularly good use of this. These are all images I shot. Okay, so now it's about the actual processing of them. So let me stop, and we're going to switch over into Photoshop world. Okay, so you guys, when you went out and shot your images in exercise 104, I asked you to try to take a bracketed set of images, right? Some of you succeeded in doing it, some of you didn't. I recognize not all cameras make it easy for you to do that. Because of that, if you go to exercises and you go to today's 107, there are a variety of downloads that you can choose to work with. And I actually thought I had them on my flash drive, but I don't, so I'm going to have to download them too. So bear with me while we get it. There is a tutorial for everything that we're doing today written out. At the bottom here, there's exercise 107 PDF, but then there's sample images group, right? I don't care which one you download. You can download any of them. Makes no difference. And if you download it and don't like the one that you have, pick a different one. Right? Looks like I've already downloaded them here anyway. Let me go ahead. You do want to make sure you extract them to your flash drive. So I'm going to extract it to my flash drive. I'm going to try to stay organized. New folder. 7. And we'll go ahead and say OK and extract. Okay, so now I'm going to go and open Photoshop. Remember, we want to make sure that we're using CS6, right? So I always go and make sure that I'm actually opening CS6. All right, so I have Photoshop open. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use what's called an automated action in Photoshop. And it's very, very common in the world of Photoshop to have these kinds of automated actions. You can actually build your own automated actions, though this one is already included in the Photoshop application itself. And I'm going to go to the File and then go to Automate. And then you can see that there's a variety of examples here. We're going to use Merge to HDR Pro. And it brings up this little Merge to HDR Pro dialog box. And when I bring that up, it's going to ask me what files do I want to use. And I'm going to click on Browse, and then I'll browse to the ones that are on my flash drive that I just downloaded. There they are. And I'll select the first one, hold down the Shift key, and select the last one so I can get all three together. I'll go ahead and say OK. And there they are. Right? Once I have those three loaded in, I am going to make sure that I check the Attempt to Automatically Align Source Images. The advantage there is if the images are slightly off, Photoshop will actually look at the images and try to correct for a little bit of handshake in these images. Once I'm done, I'll go ahead and say OK. And we're going to give Photoshop a little bit of time to work. And you can see over here that it is doing some automated actions. Some things are changing over on the layers. And so once I'm done, I get to this window, which is the Merge to HDR Pro window. And so we get a sense of what the image is. And also, if we look down here, we can see a little bit more about the three images that I'm combining together. So the primary image, the center image, has an exposure value of 0.00. Right? Remember, we talked about exposure value being an indicator of how a particular photograph is exposed. Right? Then I have an exposure value of minus 2.01, which is the dark side of the image, and I have exposure value of plus 2.03, so on the lighter side of the image. This is going to give me information about the light areas of the image. This is going to be the midtones of the image, and this is going to be the dark areas of the image. Okay? So over here, I have a variety of options that are included, and we're going to go through what some of these options mean and how they work. We have, under mode, we have 16-bit. What that's doing is a true HDR image is 32-bit. The problem is we can't actually see it on a monitor because our monitors are only 16-bit. So we tend to drop it down to 16-bit. So the default is just fine, right? There are other options. We have local adaptation, which I tend to like for my HDR image. But there are other options like equalize histogram, exposure and gamma, and highlight compression. You can play around with what those options are, though I think local adaptation tends to be the best, right? And then we're presented with a series of sliders, right? And so I like to jump to the curves menu and take a quick look at the curves because we have a histogram, and I like to make a few adjustments. Well, first thing that I'll do is I'll drag this lower section over to where it meets the bottom edge of the curve, and then I'll drag this upper section back along the top, hopefully, to where it meets the lighter section of the curve to make a little bit of an adjustment there. Right? Then I'll switch back to the Advanced tab, and I can play around with these sliders: shadow, highlight, vibrance, and saturation. If I jump up the saturation a little bit, we should get a little bit more color out of it. I'm trying to exaggerate it for you guys. You can see it great on the screen, but probably not on the projector. When you're playing with it, you'll be able to see a little bit more difference. So we'll bump up that saturation just a bit. The vibrance we can play around with as well. Generally, that goes up a little bit. The highlight, you can tell it's adjusting the sky. You might be able to see it on the screen a little bit better if I go all the way down. See how the sky is a little bit darker there? Right? If I go all the way up, the sky is going to be lighter. It's affecting only the sky, only the light sections of the image. So I want it to be a little bit darker, maybe something like that. Right? This is the shadow slider, so things that are in the shadow will get lighter. I don't know if you can see it. It's hard for me to watch the screen at the same time. So there's darker, there's lighter. Right, and we'll come back to about the mid-range there. Right, we can also adjust the exposure here, which will make the overall image lighter or darker. Right, so maybe I like that, and it's a combination of these sliders. Maybe I like that, but when I do that, my highlights need to go down a little bit more so I don't lose quite so much of the sky. And maybe my shadows need to go down a little bit too. So you can you play with these sliders is in combination for how they're working together. Once you're done and you feel like the image is okay, you're going to go ahead and say okay, and it will finish processing the image for you. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay. And it finishes processing the image. Again, we have to wait a little bit, and I end up with a high dynamic range image, and it's called background, and it's a locked layer. Okay? So I just did that HDR processing part of it. Okay? Now it's a matter of kind of tweaking the image, and in conjunction with this HDR processing, because it's relatively automated and relatively easy, we're also going to discuss another topic that's useful in Photoshop, and that is how masks work. And so we're going to do a couple adjustment layers. I'm going to do a black and white adjustment, even though I suggest doing a variety of the other ones, because I think it's the easiest one for you to see when I do it live, how the mask works. Okay? Just because I'm doing it this way doesn't mean that you need to do a black and white adjustment. You probably would rather do a levels or a curves or a channel mixer, and I'll do those too. I just want to begin this illustration with a black and white because it's a lot easier to see on the projector. Okay? So I'm going to go up to layer. I'm going to go to new adjustment layer, and I'm going to go down to channel mixer, and I'm going to call this BW for black and white, and I'll say okay. Okay. Then I'm going to check the box for monochrome, and we see that my image turns to black and white. Again, easy for you to see. And I can also go through my presets and decide which preset makes this look the best. Kind of like the orange filter. We're going to go with that. Okay. All right. So if I look over here in my layer stack, right, I have my background image, which is the image itself, and then above it I have my adjustment layer. Previously, we've always worked with the adjustment, which is this little icon here, and if we double click it, it brings up our channel mixer. The icon changes based on what the adjustment is. Okay. And then next to it, there's a little chain icon, and then there's a white square. Okay. The chain icon is just saying this is linked to this white square. Okay? And thus far, it's been like, who cares about the white square? Right? It's still applying to what I want. The white square, okay, represents this image as a whole, right? And anything that is white on this means that the channel mixer adjustment, the thing that's causing it to be black and white, is being applied to the image. Okay? So, if I changed this, which is called the mask, to be black, or a portion of it to be black, that portion of the image would no longer have the adjustment applied to it. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and make sure that the little mask is highlighted. And you can see that when I click on the layer, right, I can click on either the adjustment or the mask. And see how it has those little white arrows that kind of bracket it? Okay, that means the mask itself is selected. And I can come over here to my paintbrush, which is right here, and I'll select that. And I'm going to look at my colors. My foreground color is black, my background color is white. That's a good thing. I'm going to make sure that my foreground color is black. If yours is not black, you can double click on it and make it black, which I've done. Okay? And then I can adjust the size of my brush. Now I'm going to have a very hard brush, a little bit smaller in diameter. That's about right. And now, again, with this mask selected, I'm going to go ahead and paint part of the image. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the sky. Well, I'll paint down here. I'll paint. Let's paint the water, because that'll be kind of obvious. Okay. Let me zoom in a little bit, like this. And again, I'm on this mask, and I'm going to paint. You guys see how the color comes in? Okay. Similarly, if I look at that, what was a full blank white square, it now is a white square and has a little tiny bit of black on it. Okay. That little tiny bit of black is representing what I just painted. Okay. So let me go ahead and make my brush a little bit smaller, and the keyboard shortcut for that is the bracket key. And then I'll go ahead and paint in right along here that water. Alright, so I painted that water, plus or minus. Okay. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't perfect. Right? A few of the trees got colored in when I painted it. So in reality, I'd like to go back and zoom in a little bit more. Alright, let's look right at this edge here. See, I went, whoops. Right, can you see that that's colored a little bit, maybe? Right? I don't want that to be colored anymore. So I'm going to flip my colors from black to white. So white is my foreground color. I just click on that little arrow next to it. And then I can go back and continue painting, but this time I'll make that color go away. Like this. And it's like that. Furthermore, I could come in here to that tree section, right? Make my brush smaller, and I could paint out the tree and keep that a black tree. Right? I'm not doing a perfect job right now, right? And in reality, I might have to flip it and get a little bit smaller and then color in a little bit more of those gaps so that the water goes around the tree. Something like that. Okay? You don't really want me to sit here and do this all day, right? But the idea is that I've created a mask such that this part of the image is in color, right? The adjustment is not being applied, and the rest of the image, the adjustment is being applied. Okay? I can do the same thing up above here in the sky, for example, where I can come back to my paintbrush. Let me go ahead and make that brush a little bit bigger, make my life easier. Right, and I can paint in the sky. Let's make this a lot bigger. Again, bracket keys are your best friend when it comes to brushes. Right, and we'll get a little bit close here. Something like that. And then in reality, I probably should change my brush size and come in and get a little bit closer. And if I were doing this for my final product, I would spend a little bit more time than I'm doing, but you guys don't want to watch me fill this in perfectly. Okay, so I now have the sky, and we can confirm what's happening by very quickly turning on and turning off this adjustment layer. So when I turn it on and turn it off, you can see that all of the image comes back into color, right? Or parts of the image are in black and white. Okay? And if we look over here at the mask, you see how much of it is now black versus how much of it is white. Okay? Remember, initially it was all white. So I'm using that paint. If I want something to be semi-transparent, right, I can paint with gray. So grayscale does work in terms of allowing some of the color to come through. Okay? So in reality, the adjustment here with black and white and color is probably not what you're going to want to do. We're probably going to want to work with one of the other adjustment layers. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with curves next, and I'm going to work to try to enhance the sky. So let me go ahead and go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. Okay? And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tweak this so that I can adjust the sky itself. Right? And all I care about right now is what the sky looks like. Right? So we'll go ahead and drop the sky down a little bit. Right? I might over-exaggerate it, but I want to have the sky look really good. Okay? Obviously, it really screwed up what's down below, but I don't care because I'm going to use my mask to make it only apply to the sky. Okay? So we'll come back here to my mask. I'm going to go back to my paintbrush, and I'm going to go to black, and we'll make this a little bit bigger, and I'm going to paint off the bottom part of the image. Okay, so I go back to what my original image was there. And then let me make my brush a little bit smaller, and let me zoom in. I can pan, by the way, by holding down spacebar. And we'll get a little bit closer. A lot of times the easiest strategy is to use a big brush to get close, and then to decrease the size of the brush and try to fill in the details. And again, I'm not being perfect. You will spend a little bit more time than I will. The good news is if you go over, whoops, right? Remember, we can flip the colors, go back to white, and we can paint that back in. So nothing is permanently altered, which is important. Okay. Go back here, get a little bit closer. All right. So now if we go to Control 0, right, I have a much better exposure for the sky. Obviously, I have a little line there that needs to be corrected. Right, much better exposure for the sky, but I haven't made any problems with what's in the foreground here. Furthermore, right, we can continue this with some of the other adjustments. I could go to New Adjustment Layer. I could go to a Hue and Saturation adjustment. Say OK, right, and in this time, maybe I want to increase the color a bit. That might have been too much, but you get the idea, right, of the image. But I don't want it to apply to the sky. In this context, I don't know, maybe I do want it to apply to the sky, but the point is I'm layering these up, right? And so we'll go back here and we'll paint off the sky this time, right? And I'll go to my paint in black, and we'll paint off the sky. It's bigger.
You do it to the rocks and
Right, I could do it there, right? Maybe I don't want the rocks, right? So we can paint that out. Make this a little bit smaller. right? And again, what you're doing today, there isn't a right and a wrong answer. It's really about your eye, and I want you to learn to play around with this stuff. But if we look at the mask here, right, the white area is the center of the picture. That's where this saturation is being applied, right? The top and the bottom, the sky and the ground here don't have it applied. If we start to turn things on and turn them off, we can see where these adjustments have been applied, right? Likewise, we can layer them up, right, in terms of the sky, right? We could turn on the saturation on or off independent, right? And likewise, we could come back to the black and white if we wanted the black and white. So there's a lot of flexibility here, and I think it's important to get used to how these masks work. And so I want you to play around with that today in terms of selectively working with parts of your image. So you're going to continue with your adjustment layers and masking after you do the merge to HDR Pro. So it's a two-step thing. If you want, you can use layer blending modes, right, which we did before. In that case, we can go to our background layer, right-click, and say Layer from Background. Right-click and say Duplicate Layer. Gives us our copy, and we can change to, I don't know, multiply or screen mode or overlay mode or what have you. Point being, you can do this for a blending mode as well. So if I look at this layer, right, it says Layer 0 copy. I've changed my blending mode to overlay. It doesn't have a little white square next to it. It doesn't have a mask applied to it. I can, however, put a mask on it. And so if I come down here, there's a little icon. It kind of looks like a camera. It's a square box or a rectangular box with a circle cut out of it. That is the Add Layer Mask. If I click on Add Layer Mask, I'll get the same little white box, and I can then apply the same thing, right? So if I like the multiply everywhere except for the sky, for example, now I can go ahead and paint out the sky. And so this is blending modes with a layer mask. Make this bigger, save myself some time. All right. Point being that now is applying to that part of the image. Okay. So the layer masks work in conjunction with everything that we've already done. Okay. There isn't a right and a wrong. You don't have to do every type of adjustment and then apply a mask to it. You pick the ones that seem most appropriate to your image. Right. The point is, I want you to at least do a couple of these masks so you get the experience of working with the mask. I promise you, you will need these masks to do assignment 102. Right, so it's worth getting used to it. We will work further with masks next class, so it's not something that's going to expire. Okay, just to make sure there's not anything else. Right, you do want to make sure that you save your PSD file. So I'm just going to go to File, Save, and I'm going to save the PSD, and then I'm going to go to File, Save for Web to save the version that I'm going to post. Making sure that it's set for JPEG High, I'll click Save. I'm in the wrong folder here. Okay. Okay. One other thing, I told you many times in this class that if there was an exercise that I didn't want you to comment on, I would make sure to tell you, both written here, right, and I'm telling you verbally right now, you do not need to comment on exercise 107. Okay? The reason you don't need to comment is because we're all doing the same images, right? Some of you will have your own images, but a lot of you will just use the sample images. It doesn't make any sense to make comments on that. Okay? So you don't need to do comments. You should, however, do comments on the assignment that you just did, right? So there are still comments today, but it doesn't mean that you have to do them for this assignment or for the exercise. You just have to do it for the assignment. Okay? Are there any questions? No. Okay. I'll turn you loose.